We have had, certainly, when you factor out complaints about constitutional office holders or political positions of members of the committee on the right and the left, received more feedback about the management of chronic wasting disease. Really a plurality of responses have been about this. And I think that it is a good use of this committee's time to have this hearing, to have some questions answered about what the disease is and what it isn't, about the decisions the department has made about management, why they've made those decisions, and what public testimony and opportunity the public has had to weigh in on those decisions as you guys have been managing this. So with that, if you guys want to go ahead and introduce yourselves and kind of walk us through a little bit about where we are and what's going on, and then we'll follow up with questions from there.
Yeah, I'd be happy to get started, so thank you for the opportunity. My name is Jason Sumners. I serve as the Director of the Department of Conservation. Been in this role since June of last year, but this topic is not one that is new to me. I started with the agency in 2008, and at that time, the department did not have a fully fleshed out CWD response plan. And so it was not a matter of if, but when we would find chronic wasting disease in the state. And so I began the process of developing, analyzing other states' plans as to how we would respond. And so I sat before you as the director, but also the person that's been involved in this issue from the very, very first day.
Is it fair to say that you're the author then of the policy that's being followed?
I would largely be one of the originators of it.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Great.
In my former role as Deer Program Coordinator when I started with the agency. So joining with me is Dr. Sherry Russell. She serves as our Science Branch Chief. She's also has served in the role of State Wildlife Veterinarian, joined today by a couple of additional Deputy Directors, and Commissioner Ray Wagner, who's here because the Commission does care very deeply about this issue. We have spent tremendous amounts of time discussing the topic, not only recently, but for the last 12 plus years since the origins of this issue. I think one of the reasons why you've got a lot of comments is that citizens care about deer, and we know that, right? They're super passionate about deer and the whitetail deer resource. Wildlife viewing is an important activity for Missourians. We estimate that about 1.5 million Missourians call themselves wildlife watchers, which is accounts for about a $2 billion economic impact in the state. So it is not an insignificant component to the state's economy. Last year, 475,000 individuals hunted deer in the state. Estimates would indicate that about their economic impact is about $1.5 billion and about 13,000 jobs across the state. And I would say that those jobs are disproportionately in rural parts of the state. So we understand the importance of this deer, of this species, to our history and to our economy in the state. And so take any action related to it very seriously. So we talk about...
Mr. Sumners, I'm going to ask you to pause for just a second, and we're going to go ahead and take roll and formally start our committee because other senators have other obligations, and if we lose one, we might not get it back. So, Madam Secretary, if you'd please call the roll.
Senators Coleman.
Here.
Hudson.
Here.
Bean. Brown. Carter.
Here.
Lewis.
Here.
Williams. 4.
With 4 members, we have a quorum. Please proceed.
Thank you. And yeah, please interrupt if you got any questions along the way. I'll just providing a bit of background information to start the conversation. So chronic wasting disease is a fatal neurodegenerative disease that's caused by prions. It's not caused by a bacteria or virus, and so these things behave in a way that is not the way that we have typically thought about most of the diseases across much of what we know in terms of health. So it is transmitted largely through urine, saliva, and feces. These prions are exchanged directly from animal to animal, most likely. There also is an environmental component to it.
I want to pause you real quick, and you said most likely. So can you elaborate a little bit on the caveat about how it's transmitted?
Yes, yeah. So transmission can occur directly from animal to animal, or it potentially can occur from the environment to the animal. And so these prions don't degrade rapidly in the environment. We talk about a virus being on a doorknob for 72 hours, right? An indeterminate amount of time, these prions are infective in the environment.
So the potential for transference is not, we don't know, the science isn't established that this is a way that it can be transmitted. It is, we're not exactly sure how each individual animal contracted the disease. It could be one of these ways that we know are ways that it's transmitted.
Correct. Yes, those are definitive ways that the disease can be transmitted. They could be transmitted.
I just want to
in
make sure
number
because a
ways.
lot
Yep.
of the questions that we're getting are about confusion about why we're doing what we're doing if we don't understand the underlying science. So when
Yeah.
there was a little caveat, I
Yep.
just wanted further explanation.
Yep. So the underlying science would suggest that the vast majority of transmission is occurring directly from animal to animal. And so long as animals are still infected on the landscape and spreading it to one another, that is likely the primary source of disease transmission.
Senator Carter.
Yeah, just a quick question. I was wondering if you're seeing this regionalized in any particular area of the state or not with the chronic wasting disease. Is it more predominant in certain areas than not, or is it pretty equalized across the state?
Yeah, so the disease is relatively new to North America in that it was first identified likely in the 1960s in Colorado. And so this is not a disease that has existed across much of the landscape. So the distribution follows one in which it has been introduced or is continuing to spread. So we have, Dr. Russell could probably tell you the number of counties in which we've detected the disease to date, and then we see the spread of those diseases, the spread in terms of prevalence and distribution from those locations.
So we have
Curious.
45 positive counties. So, am I on? I'm so loud, I can't, you can't hardly tell the difference. So when we call them positive counties, that just means that we've found one deer that has it or more. So we say there's 45 positive counties, but well over 50% of those, so more than I think it's 22, but maybe 23, have found less than 10. So to your point, it's a focused infection spread in different places throughout the state, with more than half the places really being rare, and then in some places we're having more prevalence. We call it prevalence is just the percent positivity, the testing positive. That's what, when we say prevalence, that's what we mean.
And so the reason we can say that is that in the early 2000s, the department became concerned about the presence of chronic wasting disease in other western populations, primarily mule deer and elk. And so we started very aggressively doing surveillance very early on. So 2002 to 2004, we collected 22,000 samples statewide, which gave us that background understanding that if the disease was present or had been present, we would have detected it if it was at any sort of reasonable rate. And so since then, we've collected more than 300,000.
Yeah, 315,000 since then, but that's in a multi-year period, like over time.
Yeah, so the disease follows a very clear, introduction and slow spread pattern. It is not something that has always existed on the landscape. So that's why we have reason to believe that it's either been introduced by live or dead animals, so the movement of live captive cervids that were infected, or potentially through the movement of infected carcasses and improperly disposed of on the landscape, creating the opportunity for an introduction to occur. Then you get the natural deer behavior, right? The natural dispersal movements that happen, the interaction of local social groups that can lead to the slow spread.
This is all really intriguing, honestly, to me, simply because we are seeing with land application of industrial wastewater
Absolutely.
in our area, where now the EPA is coming out and saying that you have avian flu that may be crossing over because you're applying it on land, then the birds and other animals are eating that before the bacteria has time to break down, just as you're speaking. So that's why I was a little curious about whether you were seeing this in certain pockets more predominantly than others, and what might be contributing to that. So, but anyway, thank you.
Yeah, so the improper disposal of carcasses is certainly a concern, whether that's a hunter that's traveled to a place and, unknowingly harvested an animal and brought that carcass back, whether that's a taxidermist or a meat processor that, again, unintentionally was processing deer and disposed of those in a way that they were still available to deer, or some of the sources that we likely seen as the big leap across the landscape. Is really hard to say that's the cause, right? And so, yeah, it very much follows this pattern of introduction. So early on, our work was focused on surveillance, trying to detect the disease as early as possible so that management response could be as aggressive as possible in those really early stages before it gets out of control. and then to try to prevent the mechanisms in which the disease could spread across the landscape. So very early on, we put into place restrictions on the importation of carcasses into the state from places where hunters could be going that had CWD. Once the disease become present in a number of counties, we started to put within state restrictions on the movement of those carcasses and try to be very specific in the way that those carcasses could be moved across the landscape.
When was that you imposed those stages?
Please forgive me for the accuracy of dates, but the interstate carcass movement restriction would have been around 2009 or 2010, and then the intrastate within state restrictions would have been 2015 to 17, somewhere in that time range. Yeah. So again, this disease follows a pattern of early introductions, very low prevalence. Our work is to try to detect it as early as possible, and so during that same time with the intrastate restrictions on movement, we moved to mandatory sampling on opening weekend. It was the time at which we could get the most samples from the number of hunters to actually continue to monitor and track the distribution of the disease to implement meaningful management actions.
Can you talk a little bit about that mandatory sampling when it was first implemented and whether there was public comment on that or what the determination was internally in the department? I think that the mandatory sampling is probably the thing that makes people the angriest when I'm reading the responses. And just how did you guys set that policy? And
I would say that mandatory sampling has been pretty widely accepted and not. We don't receive a tremendous amount of negative feedback from the public. We went through
I'll forward you our responses from the Doge.
We're not doubting you,
I'm
but
not doubting
you
that.
probably read my face that I was like,
Much of the responses around our targeted removals, our postseason.
For sure, they're
targeted
really
removals.
mad about that. But as we're
Yeah.
kind of going through the things that people are
Yeah.
mad about, I want to give a chance
Yeah.
to have a conversation about each step. And so that way we're covering all of the concerns people
Yeah,
have
yeah. With the
mentioned.
detection of the disease in northeast Missouri, we first detected it in free-range population in 2012 in Macon County, a close association to a captive facility in which the disease was also detected. Shortly thereafter, we did shift from voluntary sampling, which was going to meat processors, going to taxidermists, having hunters voluntarily submit their samples, to mandatory sampling on opening weekend, and it's mandatorily submitting their deer for testing. For example, a hunter wants to take a deer to the taxidermist and have a shoulder mount made of it. We weren't going to cut the cape and damage the quality of the trophy, because in most cases, the taxidermists we're already partnering with to get those CWD samples. So we did ask hunters on opening weekend of the firearm season, which, close to 40% of our deer during the totality of the hunting season get harvested on those 2 days. So it gives us a great time for hunters to contribute to monitoring. And so those rules would have been made through the formal rulemaking process in which we accepted public comment. And
I'm
then
sorry, you saw
responded
me
back to them.
look over at Senator Hudson and say 40%. It's I'll stop arguing with my husband that he really has to be hunting on opening weekend then now that I have this data to support his claims.
I love that. I love that.
It used to be a much higher proportion was harvested on opening weekend, but as the season has expanded and others have had other opportunities, it is a lower number than it used to be for sure. So.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So this is fascinating to me. I've been a deer hunter for years, and the CWD thing is something that's been a concern to myself and a number of constituents. Now, you talked a little bit about how this, and it's not a virus. What is it again?
It's a prion,
A
a
prion.
misfolded protein.
A prion.
Yep.
Okay. It's somewhat hardy, I guess, in the environment. So you got a potential, like there's been a carcass that's been disposed of. A bird takes that and part of it, and can it spread that way? I mean, so can a bird?
There's possible and there's probable, right?
Okay.
So yes, it has been shown that the prions could be consumed by a scavenger, pass through the digestive system, and then still be viable on the other end. There had to be an individual deer that was infected with that disease in that location that got it somehow, that started it.
Okay.
So when that happens, you're going to see that's going to contribute to the slow localized spread of the disease, not to it jumping multiple counties, not to it jumping from eastern Colorado to central Missouri, right?
Okay.
So it is not, does it play a role in the distribution of the disease? Absolutely. Is it the primary driver of it? No. And so that's part of the challenge we face with communicating the real risk associated with CWD and what CWD management has to do. That's why I alluded to earlier the realization that those prions are active in the system, but it's still most likely that the direct transmission of the disease is happening from animal to animal. That's the primary source. Can the other things happen? Yes. Are they the most likely way in which other deer are becoming infected? No.
No. Okay. Is MDC compelling landowners to kill deer?
Not at all. It is completely a voluntary program, and since the very point at which we began, so a little bit of a history here. So in 2002. By the time we got to 2012, when we found the disease, we'd had the opportunity to watch and observe the things that were happening in Wisconsin and the things that were happening in Illinois in terms of the prevalence of the disease. And we can show you the increase in prevalence of the disease in Wisconsin through that time period. Because in 2007, they had to stop all active postseason management. But this real, very focused and very targeted approach that Illinois had done with their local landowners by their agency staff. So when we found the disease, that approach had been proven out as one that would, at least in the short term, limit prevalence and limit distribution of the disease. So when I say prevalence, it's the proportion of deer in a local area that actually has the disease. So we took that approach and we said, okay, what can we learn from what Illinois did and apply it in Missouri? And so when we did that, we knew that a lot of our hunters wanted to actively participate, right? They wanted to be a part of helping, right? We didn't necessarily want to just be removing deer after the hunting season. We wanted to do things to encourage them or make sure we weren't standing in the way of them taking deer during the hunting season. So we implemented a program where we issued CWD management seals to landowners, said, hey, if you want to take some additional deer, here's a way that you can do that. And we codified that in the wildlife code, allowed them the opportunity to do that, and then said after the season, hey, we'd still like to remove some additional deer, specifically in the places where a positive has been detected, right? So if we shoot a deer on a property, the most likely other infected deer are those within less than a mile of that single location. So how can we work with that landowner to either have them remove deer or us remove deer? And if they say no, that's fine too, right? It's completely voluntary.
So
They could choose to say no, or they could say no, we want to participate, and then that participation could either be them or somebody they want to come on their land and remove additional deer, or they could allow agency staff to do it.
So if you have a situation where a deer has been harvested, CWD positive, the landowner does not want to participate, does MDC then go to, let's say that's a large tract of land, does MDC go to smaller tracts of land, owners in the area, and ask if they want to participate?
Yes. So what we do is we define a core area, which is a 1 or 2 square mile buffer around that initial section where the positive has been detected. Because these deer have a home range and they're not only living on an individual property. That may just be where they happen to get shot at that point in time. And so then we look at that as the area in which the infection likely exists, or the place where we can do some work. And so we work with the landowners inside of those areas to do that.
Has there ever been considered the possibility of introducing deer that have a resistance to CWD to the population?
You want to talk about that one, Sherry?
Sure. So what I love talking to you, because you did your homework on what's going on in the world. So that is a hot topic across the country, because in Missouri, we consider the deer behind the fence important, their health important to us, as well as the deer outside the fence. And I just wanted to put that out there, because in some places, the wildlife agency would not concern themselves like that. But because of the way we're organized, we're taking very seriously what's happening as far as genetic selection, which is what you're talking about with regard to the captive deer situation. And I guess to make it simple, to answer your question, have we considered that as a solution for the wild population? Of course, what our job is to consider what is best for the health of the deer herd, no matter what side of the fence you're on. But the reality, the unfortunate reality to some extent, is that the number of interventions or introductions that you would have to make outside the fence, because it's a scale problem, you know, just the number of animals out there, and the impact of the genetic change is minimal. So that'll work if you have a small herd, just like if you're breeding rabbits or, you know, or anything else. But when you have a big population, I guess I'm saying we have considered it. It is not going to work. We've used some tools to model that out. We're engaged with that conversation nationally and internationally. We're following it closely. We're not ignoring that. But at this time, that's not a viable solution.
Okay.
So to add a little bit to that, one of them is the breeding system in which white-tailed deer operate. This is not a scenario in which you remove a herd bull from a cattle herd and you can very rapidly shift the genetic composition of that population by one single change, right? We know white-tailed deer, very prolific breeders, an individual male breeds relatively few females, and in fact, there's a really high rate of twins having different fathers, like so multiple parturition within a single litter. And so it basically sets the stage in which this idea that somehow you could introduce a small number of potentially genetically less susceptible individuals, although they are susceptible, they just show slower progression of the disease, to shift the dynamic of the population to somehow make it now more resistant to the disease is one that we're just not, scientifically, the basis isn't there to make that sort of a big leap or a decision.
So I love hearing him explain that, because I have to say, I'm not a deer biologist. I'm just a regular veterinarian. So I looked at the question maybe the same as you did, that I was kind of hopeful, is there something here we can do? And even if you don't consider the way deer reproduce, even if they were like Black Angus cattle, even if that were true, it still wouldn't work. So I just thought I'd share that. So depending on what are your priors, even if that were not the case. And his point about that is important here is, in the wild, they would live longer before they test positive, but they are not resistant, which is a reasonable strategy behind a fence, but not good for the environment on the outside of the fence, because they drop they're still infected, they're just not showing disease.
It's tough.
Yeah, but thanks for letting us talk about it.
No, I appreciate you. I appreciate you coming and talking about it.
Can I ask a follow-up question? For people who maybe are frankly not that concerned about the health of the deer herd as much as a human health related, there's a tremendous amount of resources that are being used to mitigate a disease that is affecting one specific species in the state. How are you making those determinations that this is a program that we're doing in advance of all of the other species that you're working on caring for? And
Yeah,
what
that-
risk does this, CWD have on human populations even?
Yeah, so our interest certainly in the commission's responsibilities to the fish, forest, and wildlife resources of the state. And so we partner and collaborate with our public health partners in terms of making those human health determinations. And so I am not a human health expert. Sherry will claim she's not a human health expert, right? So we leave those decisions up to them. So our sphere is really around allocating the resources to what we deem most important for protection of the fish, forest, and wildlife of the state.
Do you allocate that too if there is risk of cross-contamination between wildlife and humans? So bird flu is the thing everybody's talking about. That's the thing people are concerned about. And when there's so many resources going towards one specific mitigation as opposed to others, how are those decisions made?
Well, I just wanted to, I think, get at what you're thinking, which is just like, how do you make good public policy, or like how do we allocate our resources? And I think we're here to talk about chronic wasting disease, but we think of wildlife health and wildlife disease management in terms of a bigger umbrella, and we see CWD as part of that. And so We are engaged very much in the high path avian influenza, since you brought that up, and surveillance for that, among
I just
other
think it's the one that
diseases.
people
Do you
know
know what I
about the
mean?
most, other than
Right,
this one.
right. And then I think also reasonably allocation of resources, animal diseases, people diseases. I think what we're concerned about is spillover events in all of the animals. So the argument for wildlife disease at all is to both protect that population and understand that oftentimes the organisms crisscross applesauce across sectors. So we feel that's a responsibility, even if our primary responsibility is the wildlife.
So is there any evidence that Chronic wasting disease has any effect on people at all?
No. The Centers for Disease Control suggests that if you hunt in an area with, I'm giving you a longer answer than you asked, but if I
No,
were
I
you,
do.
this
I
is
want a
what
long
I'd want to
answer.
know,
This is-
right?
yeah.
So they suggest that you have your meat tested prior to consumption if you hunt in an area that has chronic wasting disease, and that is because prions are a relatively new class of thing, and they're very durable, and they're a protein, and this isn't scientific, but they're very weird. And so this wild card nature of them has our public health officials asking us to take this seriously, even though we're making no claim and we're careful to say that it's not a human disease.
So prion diseases, again, are pretty unique, and I think it's important to note that in most cases are not easily transmissible, right? They don't, prion diseases, Creutzfeldt-Jakobs occur, sort of from sporadic origins and can be transmitted under very, very specific situations. The difference between chronic wasting disease and scrapie sheep is that there is actual active animal transmission. So I think in many ways there actually is interest from the medical community because of the concern of that aspect of it, that it has been demonstrated to be able to move across live animal, maintain itself in a population, increase in distribution, and then some evidence of some species crossover. But at this point in time, there appears to be significant enough species-to-species barriers between deer and humans that the risk isn't zero, but it's really low.
Yeah, so humans have prions too. We have healthy prions, just like deer have healthy prions. I didn't know this, and I went to school longer than you can even believe, and it was like news to me that we had prions. I just got skipped, I guess. Anyway, the barrier is the shape of them is slightly different species to species, but like most things, you put enough pressure on it, you can cause change, and so there you go.
Kind of going back to more public policy kind of some questions rather than science questions.
Yes,
when you're
sorry.
codifying this policy into the wildlife code, can you talk about and maybe you guys are the wrong ones to ask this question to, and somebody else should answer from the department, but what are the public comment time
no.
frame? What is the response rate? How are you making sure that there's transparency and review process?
Yeah, so since the origins of the agency, there's always been heavy public collaboration and communication. In the 1970s, the agency invested in their first, social science like human dimensions, worrying about and concerned about the views of the public on actions that the agency has taken. And so we take a very proactive approach to any outreach and communication, any engagement involving, especially when we're making regulation recommendations that impacts, a significant number of our citizenry. So typically, the way any regulation recommendation of the magnitude of whitetail deer management would involve extensive public input opportunities. Now that we've adapted to more online forums, but in 2010 timeframe, it was a lot of public meetings. I couldn't tell you how many town hall style meetings we had in North Missouri. We went through a deer management setting plan program 2014 to 15, in which we had 22 public meetings in 14 months, including tens of thousands of online comments. Annually, we send post-season surveys to our hunters, deer hunters, turkey hunters, waterfowl hunters. Our online comment box is always open, so we get comments to the regulations committee continually, and those reports are summarized every month and shared with the commission, so they're aware of the kinds of comments that are coming in. So we take a very proactive, I think, public engagement approach in which we're always soliciting individual comments, but we're always actively surveying the public to understand, what proportion of deer hunters feel a particular way. And so that really sets the tone and says, okay, here's where we think we are. Here's the management issue that we have. We roll it out to the public. We get input. We typically have surveys that go along with that to try to quantify a particular opinion, say, what proportion of our hunters sort of agree with or disagree with this, because just counting the number of emails you get in your email box doesn't really
Correct.
tell you what the general sentiment is. It tells you what concerns they have. And then we follow the formal rulemaking process. So we'll bring a recommendation forward to the commission. They'll initially adopt it, which triggers the Secretary of State's formal rulemaking process. We follow that. If there are any comments, we take those back to the commission. The commission can choose to amend those rules. They can adopt as written, or they can withdraw them. And so we follow through that process very diligently.
Just kind of moving on, unless you have any thoughts, is kind of as we're going through the complaints that we've heard about, one of those has been you're just killing off all the deer. You are trying to ruin the sport. You're giving all these extra tags to certain areas. They're either your favorite or your hated, depending on who's commenting, who's being targeted. And can you talk a little bit about what that volume looks like, what the volume of harvested deer are in those areas, what the extra number of permits you're issuing, how those decisions are made?
Yeah, I'd be happy to provide some additional context, and certainly you guys can ask whatever more specific questions you might have. But so we initiated much more intensive postseason sampling and then shifting into targeted removals in 2012. Since that time, we've removed 26,700 deer from those areas. During that same time period, hunters have harvested 3.7 million deer.
Okay, so 26,000 to 3.7 million.
Correct. And
Yeah.
so
I don't even know what the percentages of that in my head, but
It's-
it's pretty small.
it's pretty small. If we think about Macon County, where we've been doing this from the very beginning stages, from 2022 to 2024, so
You're at 2%.
yeah, so a 3-year average, hunters were removing about 4,600 deer. Our 3-year average for postseason removals is about 260 deer. So again, it's very targeted, very localized, and this pattern holds true. That's why we adopted the Illinois approach in terms of trying to be very surgical in where the disease exists and not these broad brush, like massive reductions in deer populations that initially was attempted in Wisconsin. And Illinois has actually published a couple of peer-reviewed publications indicating that their targeted removals had zero impact on recreational hunter harvest. That if they had removed those, they likely had little to none. Now, on those properties where targeted removals are occurring, are we reducing deer densities more than what they would have been without the hunting season? Absolutely. So at a very small, fine scale, is it potentially impacting folks? Absolutely. But when we talk about this statewide deer resource of 1.5 to 1.7 million deer, in which we're trying to minimize the prevalence of this disease, trying to keep as many of these deer healthy and existing on the landscape, that very small amount of additional removal seems reasonable to me.
Do you have any questions on that? Okay. Can we let's keep moving and talk about funding. I think
Yeah.
that honestly, just kind of going through the sheet that you guys have brought is
absolutely.
very helpful. Again, one of the things that we have heard is there's a belief that the decisions that you're making are driven by financial considerations rather than the health of the deer population. And I asked the alternate version of that earlier, which is, are you putting too much resources into this? Is this also something where you're getting most of your funding from federal dollars, and maybe Missourians would prefer to leave those programs on the shelf and not take advantage of them?
Yeah, so there's many layers to that question. I think at the core of the concern is that somehow us detecting CWD positive animals on the landscape is incentivizing the agency to do additional work and generate additional revenue to the department, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. And I say that because we've received no additional federal funding to do specific CWD management work. As you'll see with the information we provided, the dollars that we are currently obtaining through federal grants are money that is obligated to the state to do with it how we feel appropriate, whether that's habitat management, whether that's research dollars, or in this case, it's CWD. We are not in some way receiving additional above and beyond funding through a federal program to support this work. Financially, in fact, it cost us $22 to have an ELISA sample run, and it cost $18 for a deer hunting permit. So on the surface, we're going, that is, some would say, well, those numbers don't add up, right? And so it is one in which we think that very targeted, that very localized approach is critical to protecting this resource that is so important to so many Missourians. And I'll share with you some of the again, survey information that the public tells us about how important they think deer are. So basically 78% agree that MDC should try to slow the spread of CWD in Missouri. 78% of our deer hunters. 77% said hunters in Missouri have a responsibility to help slow the spread of chronic wasting disease. In those cases, a very, very small proportion disagree. And so I think it is absolutely a wise use of our resources, especially when we think about the outsized impact deer have on folks' perceptions of wildlife, certainly the impact they have on our economy, as I mentioned earlier, more than a $1.5 billion economic impact. This work it's hard and it is expensive. The vast majority of the dollars that we spend, really are about staff time. And it's our staff working on CWD-related things when we would certainly rather be able to be doing public programs and doing habitat work, but recognize protecting this resource is absolutely critical. And I would add to that, I think that in many ways, deer are a reason that people make good land management decisions. We see a higher proportion of land ownership being held for recreational purposes, and there's no question in my mind that deer are a big part of that. So folks want to see healthy deer. They don't want to see sick deer out there on the landscape. And so how can we try to work aggressively and work collaboratively with the public to try to continue to maintain them as a healthy animal across the landscape? And so I do have concerns at a point where we reach, like some other states have gotten, in which prevalence is really high. Folks no longer desire to shoot them for the high quality protein that they have, and then they no longer have the same value of managing land and managing habitats that so many of us benefit from. There is a bit of a keystone species kind of mentality here, I think, that deer are a very, very important part of our natural heritage.
Dr. Russell, do you have anything that you'd like to add that hasn't been covered?
How nice of you to ask that. I just wanted to share that the comments that you got in the portal and that you hear from your constituencies, I just wanted to speak for those of us who are in the trenches, all of us who came today, but all the other people. This is a really hard thing for us. And sometimes when I read the social media, there's a certain idea that for some reason that we're not all in this together. And I wanted to sincerely represent the truth that this is hard from a management standpoint as far as the agency personnel. The science is hard. The doing all of it's hard, including getting your questions. And so I'm super grateful that we got to come and talk to you. That's mostly what I'd like to say.
I want to thank you for coming and talking to us. Thank you.
Yeah, I do too. I think that one of the things that when we started the portal to try to ask what the public's concern were about policies in the state of Missouri, I would never in a million years have guessed that chronic wasting disease would be at the tip of the spear of things that Missourians are concerned about. But you're right, from a land management standpoint, from a recreational property standpoint, people have those and maintain those resources because of the deer population. They're hunting. That's land for them to hunt on. And those are significant investments that Missouri families have made, so it makes sense that they should be concerned about it. And I knew really nothing about this before we started getting comments and before I started asking questions. And I do want to thank the department and also thank you, Commissioner, for coming, because I do think it signals really how seriously the department is taking both public engagement as well as or your engagement with the legislature. One of the things that people often get knocked on is a lack of responsivity from the
Sure.
bureaucracy.
For
That's
sure.
sort of a thing that we hear over and over again, and that has not been my experience with your department. So I'd like to thank you for your responsivity and continue to answer those questions. So our plan is to continue to share with you questions that we get, so you'll have access to that, and to try to make sure that we're a good partner for the state's taxpayers to be able to get answers to the questions that they have as they're trying to sort through what's going on.
Oh, that is so, I know that Director Sumner's he'll have something wise to say, but we consider like we're all on the same team, working for the citizens, and so we'll take the help.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, it is one of the most challenging things that I struggle with. I mean, I've spent more than 25 years of my life and many years in school and making less than I could to study this thing we call the white-tailed deer, right? The last thing I want to do is be in a scenario in which we're having to try to find ways that divide the hunting public, quite honestly, to deal with this serious issue, and I wish there were some easy, simple solutions, but the fact is a really gnarly, challenging issue in which, unfortunately, and nobody wants to hear it, unfortunately, if we do nothing, it will have long-term, exceptionally detrimental effects on our white-tailed deer population, this thing that we value so very much. And I wish
Actually,
there
before
were.
I let you go, can you talk a little bit about states that have decided to just do nothing and what the response has been to their populations?
Yes. So in the last few months, additional information has sort of started to come to fruition in eastern white-tailed deer population. We've known for about 5 or 6 years in western mule deer populations, there are clearly population scale declines in abundance as well as age structure of the population. So recently, Wisconsin completed a very long-term deer survival project in which they try to monitor survival of infected and uninfected deer, and saw a substantial decrease in survival for those deer that have CWD. And so, again, it's on the sheet that we provided you, but annual survival of an uninfected female in Wisconsin is in excess of 80%. In Missouri, it would be very similar. So that's alive on January 1, still alive on January 1. If you have CWD, your likelihood of making it back to January 1 is 40%. From a population management standpoint, the way that we've modeled out deer populations in Missouri, on an annual basis, we believe if you remove about 25% of the females through hunter-harvest, the population stays stable. So all that background mortality, we shoot another 25%, our population will remain stable. Wisconsin recently released information that would suggest when the prevalence of CWD in their adult females reaches 29%, their populations are now in decline. So they are no longer stable. They're no longer increasing. Any number above that, any additional hunter harvest on top of that, and the population declines. So completely taking your hands off once prevalence gets to 29%. Adult males, annual survival in excess of probably close to 70% of an uninfected individual, about 20% if you're an infected individual. And so not only do you have the pressure of just trying to survive the disease and the susceptibility, what they've found is that those individuals are also much more susceptible to harvest. So their buck harvest rates go up because they're just a little bit slower. They don't look like they look bad, but they're a little slower and they're a lot more vulnerable to harvest. So those two indicators that not only is it going to affect the population, is relatively few bucks will make it into those older age classes, which more and more individuals that hunt deer want to shoot bucks that are in older age classes have nicer antlers. Very similar sort of project just getting wrapped up in Arkansas, in which earlier this calendar year, they shared information with their commission that indicated that they have, inside of kind of their big core area they identified a few years ago, a 14% annual decline in deer populations with very similar sorts of survival metrics. So if we do nothing, We know the disease is going to continue to increase in prevalence. It's going to continue to kill deer, and unfortunately, we're going to end up with more sick deer on the landscape in the short term, and likely fewer deer, a much reduced, suppressed population that's suppressed by the disease killing them, not hunters shooting healthy deer, and then not hunters being able to consume the valuable venison that we get from those deer that we harvest. It's a very doom and gloom, and I hate it.
I know, to end
wish-
on that note, but
But to end on that
yeah.
note, we've been successful. When you look at the trajectory of the disease in those states that have not taken action, when you look at the trajectory of the disease in Illinois where they've taken very aggressive action, where we've been able to work with landowners, we still have very low prevalence rates. We're 12 years out in Macon County, and prevalence rates there are still extremely low. So there's still a lot of really healthy deer on the landscape. Is it some of the ways that we would like to do, would like to manage deer populations? No, but the reality is the disease is here, and ignoring it isn't a really good option, because we will be sitting here in a decade saying, why didn't you guys do more, unfortunately.
Well, thank you again for your partnership with
you.
the legislature and coming and spending this time this morning to talk with us, or this afternoon, excuse me, about what's going on with the management of this. And again, I think from a public policy standpoint, the transparency is really important. So thank you guys.
Happy to do it,
Thank you.
seriously.
Completely.
Thank you.
Okay, this is going to go ahead and conclude the hearing on government efficiency.
I will second. Yeah, I know.